So in class, we talked about the definition of a forest, and we talked about different ways that forests work as an ecological system. And we generally agreed that a forest is an ecosystem dominated by trees as the main type of vegetation. And then we talked a little bit about this concept that I'm going to show you in this diagram here, is basically where we get forests, and we have some really big general forest types. And the forest types that we find in different places are really determined by the climate. So as you can see here on the y-axis, we've got mean annual temperature, and so temperatures are getting warmer as you go down the y-axis. And on the x-axis is mean annual precipitation, so we're getting wetter as we go left to right. And so we see over here, up at the top where we have very cold temperatures, this is where we have boreal forest. I think I have a line here, yeah. So boreal forests are northern forests dominated by conifers. And you can see the mean annual temperature is quite cold. In some places, the annual temperature can be below freezing. In reality, what you need to support trees is you need 1 month where the average temperature for the month is at least 10 degrees Celsius, or about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, if it's too cold, you just can't photosynthesize enough during the growing season to support the large biomass of trees. So there you'll get Arctic tundra. And boreal forests can be quite dry, so we can see around 100 centimeters of precipitation to fairly wet, about 100 to 200 centimeters of precipitation. Let's see if I can get rid of that arrow. Great. Another forest type here we have is temperate deciduous forest. And you can see here this lovely picture of fall colors in the eastern United States. And temperate deciduous forest, it's warmer, right? So our mean annual temperatures are higher, and it's typically wetter than boreal forest. So now here we're talking about, maybe 150 to 250 centimeters of precipitation. If you get drier than that, we can see we have different woodland types here. So different types of woodland and savannas. You have some trees, but it's typically too dry to support a lot of trees. And then, of course, tropical rainforest is sort of the warmest, wettest, right? We're down here in the very warm temperatures on the y-axis, and it's very wet indeed. More than 300 centimeters of precipitation per year. Most of this forest is evergreen. There's a really high biodiversity of trees and lots of other organisms in the tropical rainforest. Another type of forest we have here, tropical deciduous forest. So again, this is in the tropics and it's very warm all year, but this is in places where you have seasonal drought. So you have a rainy season and a dry season. And you can see in this photo here that the leaves are off those trees. And so we have many trees in the tropical deciduous forest where they lose their leaves when it's in the dry season to avoid moisture loss. And then they'll regrow their leaves, they'll resprout when the rainy season arrives. I don't have a picture here, but we also have wet, cooler forests called temperate rainforests. This is what we find in, especially along the west coast of North America, the northwest coast of North America. So think about those sort of large trees, very wet and cool forests of the Pacific Northwest. We also mentioned in class a little bit about the sort of evolutionary history of trees. And the take home here is that we've got our two main taxa here, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So basically our naked seed plants are our gymnosperms and our flowering plants are our angiosperms. And gymnosperms are quite ancient, right? So you can go way back here in the Paleozoic and you can look back 350 million years in the Carboniferous period and you can see early gymnosperms. And in fact, you don't have to look back you can look back quite far into the Permian and you can start to see things like early conifers and things that look quite a lot like pines and spruce of today. So they go back quite a ways. The flowering plants, so all our sort of, our deciduous broadleaf trees that we're familiar with, any plants that flower, they evolved much more recently. So here in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, so we're talking only maybe about 150 million years ago, and then they diversified greatly. a lot of diversification, a lot of different kinds of flowering plants, because it was a really successful sort of evolutionary strategy. One of the earliest angiosperms in terms of trees is magnolias, and we'll see some magnolias on campus. But again, a very ancient flowering plant, but conifers and gymnosperms in general are much, much older. Okay, so we're going to focus a lot, especially when we do dendrology, we're going to organize our study of dendrology based on different forest types and the types of forests that we find in different locations. One explanation for why we have different forest types where we have them has been a study of biogeography for a couple of hundred years. And in general, so we have these sort of big domains of sort of similar vegetation, right? We have the Palearctic and the Nearctic. So Nearctic, the New World temperate, right, outside the tropics. Paleoarctic, Old World, outside the tropics. And then we have a sort of tropical zone, right? So our neotropical, and we have our Old World tropics, Ethiopian, Oriental, and Australian. And then we have our Antarctic, right? Our southern zones, which is pretty much just New Zealand, the southern part of South America, and maybe the southern tip and the Cape region of South Africa. In general, we see a lot of similarities in this direction. The old World Arctic and New World Arctic have a lot of similarities in terms of their vegetation. The tropics a little less so. And then there's not very much similarity if you go across the equator, right? The northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere are very different. So although we have temperate forests down here in Patagonia, in southern tip of South Africa, and in New Zealand, and even to some degree Tasmania, those forests are really different from the temperate forests that you find in North America and Eurasia. But the Eurasian forests and North American forests are much more similar. Okay, so what explains this pattern? Well, part of it has to do with continental drift and plate tectonics, right? So the history of which land masses were connected more recently versus less recently. And so Eurasia and North America were connected much more recently. This is about 200 million years ago. This is just a snapshot in time in the lower right. But we had a supercontinent called Laurasia, which was pretty much the Old World and New World Arctic domains. And then our southern continents, South America, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, were all part of another supercontinent called Gondwana. Now, these were connected at some points in history, but again, the connections were much more recent between the north and the south, and less so across, right? And another reason that we have similarity east-west but not north-south is it's much harder to disperse across the tropics, right? Imagine you're a tree and you've evolved frost hardiness, so you can survive the temperate regions, you can survive winter. It's going to be really difficult to sort of disperse and evolve into sort of a tropical species and then go to the other hemisphere and evolve frost-proofness again, right? It's much more difficult than, say, just moving east to west along or the similar line of latitude. So worldwide, we have very distinct flora in northern and southern hemispheres, and relatively similar flora, especially in the northern hemisphere, across continents east to west. Okay, but then we have some other interesting stories. So let's just talk about North America and Europe. Now we're going to talk about North America a lot in this course because we're really going to focus on North American forests and North American trees. But let's talk about North America versus Europe. Another thing that influenced what species are present in the forests had to do with glaciation, cycles of glaciation. So glaciers and ice sheets advanced during colder periods of Earth's climate, and they receded during warmer periods. And as ice sheets expanded and climate changed, we had what we call refugia. So plants that can't live in the tundra or can't live, well, no plant can live under an ice sheet really. They had to migrate south to warmer climates. Now that wasn't a real problem in North America. but it was a real problem in Europe, which we'll see in a minute. So the main reason we have a really rich diversity of temperate trees in North America has to do with just the simple orientation of our mountain ranges. So most of the mountain ranges in North America are oriented north to south. So if you're a tree and you're living up here in Ontario, you can disperse southward if climate is cooling and glaciers are accumulating and so on. More of your progeny will be able to regenerate and grow and mature and set seed and so on. And you can very slowly kind of move down. You can move down the axis of the Appalachians, you can move down the axis of the Rockies, and you can escape to glacial refugia. However, if you're in Europe and you're a tree, you can try to do the same thing. Glaciers will advance from the north as climate gets colder, but the problem is the mountain ranges of Europe and Asia are oriented east to west. So a tree and its offspring and its seeds and its seedlings will run into the Alps, or they'll run into the Caucasus, or some of these other east-west mountain ranges, and then those mountains are too high, it's too cold, can't get over them. So as a result, there are many genera that we have in North America that are extinct in Europe. You can see them in the fossil record in Europe, but during the last couple of ice ages, they eventually all went extinct in Europe. So hickory and chestnut and hackberry and black walnut and tulip, poplar, magnolia, ironwood, hemlock, these are all trees that we have in North America. They were able to escape the advance of glaciers and find refuge in the south and then migrate back north as climate warmed, but in Europe they were gone. So this is more or less the distribution of vegetation zones at the broadest global scale. And like I said, we're going to focus on North America. And so the main forest types in North America, of course we have Arctic tundra up here in blue, but we have a big zone of boreal forest, that's the dark green. We have a big zone of temperate deciduous forest, or temperate seasonal forest. We do have some subtropical forest down here in Florida below the frost-proof line where it doesn't freeze. We're not going to talk too much about that because we're not going to really talk about tropical forests in this course. And then, of course, we have along the west coast, this sort of teal color, we have temperate rainforest, so that cool, moist rainforest. And then what's not really shown on this map is we have forests in the Rocky Mountains. So this is areas that is typically too dry and too warm to support forest, but up in the mountains we do have enough moisture and precipitation. So those forests are very similar to boreal forest in a lot of ways, but they're also fairly distinct. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about sort of the two really broad types of forests that we have in North America. The freeze-hardy forests, trees that can survive winter. And those are the boreal forests and the temperate forests. You can see them on this map. The boreal forest is the green, the temperate forest is that sort of orange or brown color. So we'll talk about those in a little bit of detail and talk about some of the species and some of the genera that you find in those forests.